and assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland.
To try and channel it for
You will see a procession of
deny what they think is false, argue what they think is false. You have to have free and uncorrupted communication.
In very recent years, the consolidation of media ownership and its impact on what we know and what we can share has captured some attention in progressive political circles and academic ones. However, this process of stealth of our common wealth has been happening for decades and noted by some. Of course, we must nod to Ben Bagdikian, whose book Media Monopoly, published in the early 1980s, began to quantify this trend, and to people like Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky, who analyzed the impact on our polity. But Norman Solomon and his colleagues at Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting began to provide us with detailed critiques of even our best media outlets through their magazine Extra. In 1987, and for students I should say, there was no internet available to us then, so we didn't have access to hundreds of papers. In 1987, they began with an issue highlighting consolidation of ownership and have continued until now. The most recent issue examines the Downing Street memo. I think you all probably know what that is. That they have managed to sustain this periodical is remarkable in itself. But Norman and his band have also created and nurtured other projects like the radio programs Making Contact and Counterspin, both carried on KCSB. And for those of us who do media, the Institute for Public Accuracy is an invaluable resource providing us with contact information for various people whom we can bring to you on the air with expertise, not just opinions. These are institutions Norman Solomon has helped to imagine and build. In his spare time, he's a nationally syndicated columnist and the author of several books, including his most recent, War Made Easy, How Presidents and Pundits Keep Spinning Us to Death. Other books include Target Iraq, What the News Media Didn't Tell You, The Trouble with Dilbert, How Corporate Culture Gets the Last Laugh, and The Habits of Highly Deceptive Media. This last one won what I think is a remarkable honor, the George Orwell Award for Distinguished Contribution to Honesty and Clarity in Language from the National Council of Teachers of English. Despite all of his work in the run-up to the Second Gulf War, or the reheating of the first one, really, Norman personally convinced Congress people to visit Iraq, and he accompanied them to that beleaguered country in an effort to prevent what is proving to be the quagmire that he and many others anticipated. This is the second occasion on which I've had the opportunity to work with him in person, and I'm certainly richer for it. And I would like you to join me now in welcoming Norman Solomon.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. We're here in the Multicultural Center, and we need words like multicultural to remind us that the world is the world rather than the distortions that the U.S. news media tend to depict the world in and through. When I think of the antithesis of a monoculture, and I try to remember who lives on this planet, I often think of in media terms, the metaphor of healthy ecology. I lived for many years in the Pacific Northwest, which of course produces a lot of, so to speak, produces a lot of trees. And every once in a while, I would drive by this forest that looked like toothpick farms. There's a lot of very beautiful old-growth forests. And then it really jumped out at me, just this very sort of, strictly speaking, forest, but all you can see is trees, not undergrowth, not an ecological presence to speak of. They're replanted forests after clear cutting. And technically they are forests, but you can tell the difference. And news media, I think, in this country very much are, on the whole, with some notable exceptions, the equivalent of clear cutting. Yes, they are media. Yes, journalism takes place. But it is the equivalent of toothpick farms, in contrast to the vibrant media ecology that we have a right to, that news media can provide to the body politic of the country. And to switch metaphors here for just a moment, I think of the circulation of ideas, information, perspectives, the possibility that discourse could move through the body politic. That is the circulatory system of democracy. When it's blocked, when it's prevented from circulating, that's when you have problems in the body politic, and we have problems aplenty. It's always helpful to think about what might be possible, and one of the sayings that many people have adopted in recent years around the planet in many languages is, another world is possible. I first heard that at the World Social Forum in Porto Alegre, Brazil, in 2001, early in that year. And there was a session, one of hundreds, a session where the great writer Eduardo Galeano spoke. And he told of walking down the streets of a Latin American city, and there on a wall in big letters, somebody had scrawled, "Let's save pessimism for better times." And here we are now in the middle of the first decade of the 21st century, and I think that that sort of a spirit is more needed than ever. We have obvious problems globally, nationally, regionally, and manifested locally. I was in Salinas, California in April of this year. Walked down the streets of a neighborhood where children were playing in trailer parks in extreme poverty. Many third world countries would have considered it to be an impoverished area of the city. And then down the street a ways, I came to the Cesar Chavez Library, where a 24-hour protest was in progress because the city council had announced that because of a lack of funds, all of the public libraries would need to be shut down. And this is a city of 150,000 people, which at full throttle, the public library system had 3 libraries. And I had just walked through a neighborhood where the parents of those children I saw playing on the cement in the trailer parks, pick our crops, give us our food, literally hand us our food. And yet we have a political economy that in 2005 said that they and their parents and their grandparents had no right to access to a public library. And so when people came to terms with that projection for the closure of all the public libraries in Salinas, California, they did what people do around the planet when they decide to be active rather than passive consumers of history. They organized, and they organized a protest. And when I got there, there were already authors and others, writers, artists, at the podium, in rotation, speaking, reading from their work. And as night fell, there was a projection on the side of the wall of the Cesar Chavez Library, and it was a continuous kind of odometer spinning of numbers, showing how many tax dollars to that moment had been sent by the taxpayers of Salinas, California, to the war in Iraq. The number was, at that point in April of 2005, $84 million. Of course, it's a lot more now. $84 million sent from taxpayers of a city who were told that there was not enough money to keep their libraries open. And I thought of the previous time, actually the first time that I'd ever seen what I saw that night on the hillside next to the library, which was a tent encampment of protest against the projected closures of the libraries. The first time I'd seen a tent encampment was in 1968. It was early summer, and the Poor People's Campaign had reached Washington, D.C., pitched the tents for a little encampment called Resurrection City. Days after I had a chance to visit that encampment, the federal government literally and figuratively called in the bulldozers and crushed the end of the Poor People's Campaign. Another era in which the tax dollars by the billions went to a far-off war based on deception, while here at home there was not enough money for the basic human needs to be met by a government that pled its own poverty as therefore inability to challenge poverty at home effectively. When you think about the way in which history moves, it moves inexorably, and from that time in 1968 to today, well over a third of a century, so much has changed, and yet in many ways so little has changed. And we have now the rhetoric translated, transmitted through our news media about how the private sector will provide, that the era of big government is over, unless, of course, we talk about the Pentagon and a prison system, in which case we're told that spending is necessary. But we're told that the private sector will jump into the breach, and after some embarrassing publicity, that is indeed what happened in Salinas in 2005. The read-in protest that I described to you was a couple of days later written about, published article in the New York Times. It was a fairly lengthy article, as these things go, a pretty good article. Didn't get around to mentioning the connections that many speakers made to the war in Iraq and the spending on that war. Didn't get around to mentioning the odometer spinning on the wall or the signs that connected the spending on war and the lack of spending capability, people were told, for libraries. But that aside, it was maybe a bridge too far to make those connections for that particular New York Times article. Still, it was a decent article, and it was embarrassing. A sizable city closed its libraries. So the private sector jumped in. We've heard about public-private partnerships. You remember after what became known as the Rodney King riots early in the last decade of the 20th century, there was all this talk about public-private partnerships. And you can go to Los Angeles today and see what came of that, which is not much more than a whole lot of nothing. But what happened in Salinas? Well, you had this private sector jumping in and working with government officials. And then months and months later came the announcement, because the beginning of the summer was supposed to mark the closure of those libraries. And then came the announcement that the libraries could stay open because the private sector had come through. And as a result, each one of those three libraries, the Cesar Chavez Library, another one that was named after someone who was born in the city, the John Steinbeck Library, and the third library, that all three of them could stay open. Each one of them could stay open for 11 hours a week. And this was the fruition of our corporate-driven system of governance. Well, how does it happen that one decade after another, wars are sought by the president who is successful to bring the country into the war? That's a question that I tried to answer in researching and writing my new book, War Made Easy. I went back over the last 50 years, and I looked at the contemporaneous media coverage, the lines that were put out, the explanations that were given through the news media out of the White House and the administration and then out of Congress for why a war was necessary. And I found a lot of commonalities of messages, kind of a recycling, you might say. Sure, the media technologies have evolved, the styles have shifted. But in many ways, you go from the early 1960s to the middle of this decade now, and there's not a whole lot new under the sun. My book has been out about 2-3 months now, somewhere in there, and it's been reviewed by a grand total of one daily newspaper in the United States, which is the LA Times. I'm not complaining, it was a favorable review. And there was one aspect of the review I want to mention to you. There was a caveat, or kind of a critique, a negative comment in the review, that this book started with an obscure war, the U.S. invasion of the Dominican Republic. And in point of fact, I wanted to start the book writing about the U.S. invasion of the Dominican Republic in the spring of 1965, in many ways because it's so little remembered. It is so, at least in the consciousness of the U.S. media, so to speak, I suppose you could say, an obscure war. It was not, I think we could say, obscure for the 3,000 citizens of the Dominican Republic who were killed during the invasion, nor has it been obscure since then for their loved ones. But the perspective in history, we might say, is all. We're told that journalism is the first draft of history, but when you look at the real coverage of the agenda setting for war, the coverage when the war gets underway and as it continues, you see in retrospect that it's the first draft of history in our daily newspapers and so forth, our weekly magazines, and transmitted through other media. But for most people, it's also the last version. So what kind of history do we get, especially the history reported at the time? Well, it's riddled with omissions. Aldous Huxley wrote in his introduction to Brave New World that lies are powerful, but even more powerful is silence about truth. And there's so much silence in the news media. And eventually, maybe some of the information will come out. Napoleon said it very well. It's not necessary to censor the news. It's sufficient to delay it until it no longer matters. And so when we look back, we see this tragedy. I almost said tragicomedy, but if people weren't dying, it would be often, the absurdity would be hysterically humorous. But the tragedies of one war after another we see replayed, based on deceptions, the news media, far from being the watchdogs, functioning as the lapdogs. And so on the morning of April 26, 1965, there was a conversation with President Lyndon Johnson talking with an official from the State Department. What had happened in the Dominican Republic that led up to this conversation? Well, the Trujillo regime for 3 decades had been a very bloody tyranny. Trujillo died early in the 1960s, and there was, for the first time in 61, a free election, first one the Dominican Republic had had in people's memories. And Juan Bosch was elected by almost 2/3 of the vote. He took office, and a few months later, he was overthrown by the military. Fast forward to 1965 in the spring, there was an uprising to restore the democratically elected Bosch presidency. And in the city of Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic, that uprising was close to success. And then the United States government stepped in. We know now what Lyndon Johnson was saying on the phone that morning to Thomas Mann, not to be confused with the novelist, but somebody of the same name, an Assistant Secretary of State. We know because a few years ago, several decades after the events, the tape recordings were released, finally. Lyndon Johnson liked to record things, and he did a lot of his work on the telephone. So several decades later, we know now what was said. Lyndon Johnson, President of the United States, said, "We're going to have to really set up that government down there and run it and stabilize it some way or another. This Bosch is no good." And the Assistant Secretary of State, Thomas Mann, replied, "He's no good at all." And then he added, "If we don't get a decent government in there, Mr. President, we get another Bosch. It's just going to be another sinkhole." Then immediately the president replies, well, that's what you ought to do. That's your problem. You better figure it out. And then moments later, the Assistant Secretary of State is replying, the man to get back, I think, is Balaguer. He's the one that ran way ahead in the polls. And then the president replies immediately, well, try to do it, try to do it. Well, who is Balaguer? In a way, just think Ahmed Chalabi. He was somebody who was, with some differences, and Chalabi hadn't been in Iraq, the favorite pet exile of the Pentagon, had not been in Iraq for decades. In contrast, Balaguer had served as kind of a figurehead for the Trujillo regime in its last years, and ended up in New York after Bosch came into power and then the coup and so forth. So long story short, when Lyndon Johnson decided that the United States needed to invade the Dominican Republic, he checked with Balaguer, who, naturally living in New York, knew exactly what was going on in the Dominican Republic. And Balaguer advised the U.S. government about how to proceed with the invasion. Well, President Johnson went on television. He said, we're concerned because there are U.S. citizens in the Dominican Republic, they're in danger. And then a couple of days later, with the Marines having moved on in, he went back on television. He said, not only that, but we're worried there's some subversion, some communists involved with the uprising there, so we need to go in and stop them. And then 2 days later, again, he went on primetime television and said, now we know there are communists involved, and Fidel Castro and his communists have tried to subvert this genuine uprising into something bad. Well, 20,000 U.S. Marines went in. They were able to reverse the momentum of this pro-democracy movement, essentially, and Bosch was prevented from taking power. And the next few decades, we had Balaguer and other people of a similar bent, serving the similar interests, ruling the Dominican Republic, where poverty has remained severe, where what is now known as the neoliberal agenda of corporate globalization has ruled supreme. And so in many senses, the invasion of the Dominican Republic of 1965 and the lies that were told, because I should mention, as I document in the book, that what Lyndon Johnson said about the communists being involved, about American citizens being endangered, all of that was total fraudulence, absolute lies. And yet they served the purpose to do the media propaganda, to try to justify, and for most media outlets effectively so, the invasion, and that was that. It's a way in which, as in so many other instances, the past isn't really past. It still lives in terms of what's possible for people's lives. One of the things that we've heard from one president after another is how much they love peace. And I found, looking back at the archives of public statements and the media coverage that was featured in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and indeed in this decade as well, that the more a president talked about how much he loved peace, the more he was engaged in war. So here are a few examples. We had a fateful spring 40 years ago, about the time of the Dominican Republic invasion, where the escalation of U.S. troops involvement and the deployment of troops to Vietnam drastically spiked up. April 10th, 1965, early into that spring, Lyndon Johnson said, "We love peace, we hate war, but our course is charted always by the compass of honor." Kind of an echo, doesn't that sound familiar? When George Herbert Walker Bush was running for president in 1988, he said, "I hate war, I love peace. We have peace and I'm not going to let anybody take it away from us," unquote. 16 months later, he was ordering the invasion of Panama. But you walk through year by year, it's just a kind of a sampler. As the war in Vietnam escalated and escalated, in 1964, President Johnson said, "Our one desire, our one determination is that the people of Southeast Asia be left in peace to work out their own destinies in their own way." 1965, Vice President Hubert Humphrey said, "Our commitment to strengthening the peace has not weakened." 1966, President Johnson, I do not genuinely believe that there's any single person anywhere in the world that wants peace as much as I want it. 1967, Vice President Humphrey, there is no quick and easy way to peace. It must and will be built out of the cumulative acts of men and women who dedicate their lives to the service of their fellow man and therefore to the service of God. And on and so on and so on. The Vietnam War, of course, at that point, massively murderous. The B-52s dropping incendiary bombs, napalm, cluster bombs, slaughtering what turned out to be a death toll estimated at 2 million Vietnamese people, while the U.S. president, with the news media, conveying, usually uncritically, the White House declarations of desire for peace. Well, you can move ahead into the beginning of this century, and you see how it was framed early on. Of course, there was a lot of talk about the shift of millennium, and so the largest news magazine in the United States, in its last issue of the 20th century, on its final page, ran an opinion piece by its habitual columnist, Charles Krauthammer, and it was headlined in Time magazine, "A Second American Century?" ? And the answer that he provided was at least a qualified yes. This is what Mr. Krauthammer wrote. Quote, "The world at the turn of the 21st century is not multipolar but unipolar. America bestrides the world like a colossus." And then Mr. Krauthammer went on to explain to readers that they should be encouraged to perceive that that's a good situation. He wrote, "The main reason for the absence of a serious challenge to American hegemony is that it is so benign. It does not extract tribute. It does not seek military occupation. It is not interested in acquiring territory." He, being a realist, he recognized that there were some foreign rivals who are restless. He wrote that the world is stirring in his words, yet he said the outlook was favorable. Quote, "None have the power to challenge America now. The unipolar moment will surely last for at least a generation." Well, we now, of course, are in the middle of wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And a lot of the arguments given for past wars of the last decades have been and are being given now to justify these wars. And when I tried to kind of assess what are these messages that keep being used to such useful effect for those who plan and implement wars, I came up with 17 kind of boilerplate messages that formed the titles for the chapters of this book. And the first one is the kind of implicit message that is very powerful, and it's rarely stated quite so boldly, although Charles Krauthammer talked about how benign and beloved the U.S. government was at the turn of the century. But it's often very implicit, and that is a very powerful form of propaganda. You know, the sort of message that says, well, everybody knows, let's assume, if you're reasonable, we know this, and then let's move on from there. We see it on the front pages in the United States very often with statements like this, and I think if you read newspapers often, you'll recognize this. It's not attributed to anybody. It's a statement by the reporter himself or herself in the reportorial voice. And it goes something like this. In its efforts to promote democracy in the Middle East, the Bush administration, and then fill in the blank, right? Or in pursuit of its goal for democracy, the Bush administration. Well, if we're going to take that as the objective fact that needs no attribution because on the face of it it's so true, then a lot of the argument is already severely skewed. If that's really what the White House foreign policy is about in what it's doing, what the U.S. military is doing around the world to promote democracy, then we assume very great motivations. And some coverage may acknowledge that there's ineptitude, there's ideology, there's rigidity, there's lack of competence. And so all kinds of critiques can be made, but they're tactical critiques, and they don't, with rare exceptions, they don't raise the question of, well, maybe the motivation is not really to promote democracy. The first time I went to Iraq, I went with a very fine, freelance, independent reporter, Reese Ehrlich, who's reported for the Dallas Morning News, the St. Petersburg Times, freelancing as well for NPR News, Morning Edition, and All Things Considered. And as he later put it, we were talking, and then he wrote this as well, not for those papers, but in a book that we co-authored. He said, American journalists, by and large, when they work overseas, they accept the prerogatives of the U.S. government to intervene militarily. And their quibble is sometimes with how and when it is done, or as he put it, U.S. journalists don't win Pulitzers for questioning the U.S. empire. And that's, I think, a fair enough statement. Well, what is this implicit message that I tried to summarize in terms of news media spin coming out of the White House? I put it this way. America is a fair and noble superpower. And that is often implicit. But then there are other messages that are titrated, they're adjusted depending on the war situation. They come in at full force more at different cycles of promoting a war. And I think we can call it a spin cycle for war promotion, that it's not simply a matter of they want to start a war, there's certain messages, and that's that, or a war is underway and then there's no war promotion, because indeed arguing about the current war is also a way of arguing about a war to come. Another way to put it, arguments now about the Vietnam War are often coded arguments about this war as well. I've had this experience talking about the War Made Easy book on some radio shows. I was on one, the Jim Bohannon show. It's on Westwood One. It's national. It reaches a lot of people in many different states, you might say a cross-section of the population. And there was a call on the show from somebody who very much disagreed with what I was saying, and he said, for example, look at how the United States cut and run from Vietnam. We can't be doing that again. And he said, we left way too soon. And I mentioned on the air in response that the best estimates are 2 million Vietnamese people were killed in the course of that U.S.-driven war over a period of 10, 12 years. And I asked on the air, well, how many Vietnamese people do you think the United States should have been involved in killing? And the answer was, and I'm quoting here, as many as it took. Well, this is an expression of what Martin Luther King Jr. called the madness of militarism. The kind of the mania that begins to justify all kinds of slaughter in our names with our tax dollars, reinforced through the media coverage of omission and commission. And we're in one part of the spin cycle now, but I think we should make no mistake. It is also an argument about future wars, whether this one was sufficiently justified, albeit with mistakes and problems, or what some people call a quagmire, to justify the next ones coming down the pike, Syria, Iran, whatever that might be. Here are some of the other lines that I kind of condensed in terms of chapter titles. Our leaders will do everything they can to avoid war. Our leaders would never tell us outright lies. This guy is a modern-day Hitler. This is about human rights. This is not at all about oil or corporate profits. They are the aggressors, not us. If this war is wrong, Congress will stop it. If this war is wrong, the media will tell us. Media coverage brings war into our living rooms. Opposing the war means siding with the enemy. This is a necessary battle in the war on terrorism. What the U.S. government needs most is better PR. The Pentagon fights wars as humanely as possible. Our soldiers are heroes, theirs are inhuman. And then the last two, very much what we're in the thick of now in terms of Iraq. America needs the resolve to kick the Vietnam syndrome, and withdrawal would cripple U.S. credibility. Well, these are the same arguments, the cut-and-run arguments. And by the way, President Lyndon Johnson used that phrase repeatedly, that we can't cut and run from Vietnam. And President George W. Bush used that phrase repeatedly as well. We can't cut and run from Iraq. I've come to think of three layers in terms of war propaganda in this country. Yes, it's a kind of an intersection between Pennsylvania Avenue and Madison Avenue. It's generated out of the White House and the executive branch, usually taken up by most people in Congress. Standard PR operating procedure methods. Advertisers know you have to bang on the same drum, send the same message, repeating again and again. The essence of propaganda is repetition. Can't cut and run. We have a responsibility. And then a lot of lies thrown in. Remember, Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, told on the front page of the New York Times as though it were absolutely factual because there were sources. There were sources that told the reporters of the New York Times that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq to justify an invasion. And it turned out, of course, that there were not. Well, who were the sources? Well, they were mostly Ahmed Chalabi, Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz's favorite Iraqi exile. Hadn't been in Iraq for a few decades, but he knew what was going on there. And he was the unnamed source that was used by the New York Times. And then you had this dynamic of Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, Powell, Cheney, going on national television saying, look, it's not just us saying there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Look at what the New York Times just reported. Well, the New York Times had just reported what the flunkies for the Pentagon had told them and given those sources, unnamed, credibility. Well, why is it important that they're unnamed? Because there's an obvious motive here. Ahmed Chalabi wanted the U.S. invasion, and he was feeding information to try to gin that up. Well, I'm doing a lot of talk shows and radio in particular now, and there's a theme that comes up. Sometimes it's the host, sometimes a caller. At times it's said with a kind of a gravity that we're to assume is really a profound point. And it's said sometimes almost in exactly these words. You know, Iraq is not Vietnam. And my response is, well, any competent geographer will agree with that. But what does that really mean? Well, of course, the histories of Iraq and Vietnam have been different. And you could say, to some extent, although less so than we might like to believe or the news media tend to propagate the idea of, that there were differences in the history of U.S. military intervention in both countries. But I've come to think of it in these terms as well, that yes, okay, Iraq is not Vietnam, but the United States is the United States. And the patterns and the fabric of society, the political economy of the United States of America during the Vietnam War, and the dynamics at play during the war on Iraq, they're coming from what we could call the military-industrial media complex. Now, I like to quote the great left-wing analyst, President Dwight David Eisenhower, who warned against the military-industrial complex that could gain undue power over the priorities of the country. And Eisenhower also gave what came to be known as the Cross of Iron speech, where he talked about, and I'm paraphrasing here, but as he said, every bomber, every tank, every battleship is in a real sense a theft from the children of the world. And in 2005, that heist continues. It's going on in Salinas, California. It's going on in Santa Barbara and New York City and every city and town in this country, and in Iraq and elsewhere on the planet. The priorities that puts buying weapons and selling weapons and going to war above health care and education and housing and environmental protection. It's a set of priorities that are very much in step with what Dr. King called the madness of militarism. And when Martin Luther King said that the bombs in Vietnam exploded home, he was referring to exactly that dynamic. As he said, you can talk about guns and butter all you want, but when it comes to engaging in war, you don't even end up with good oleomargarine. And in 2005, we see what's going on in our own communities, while the largesse for warfare seems virtually infinite. So yes, Iraq is not Vietnam, but those who are coming home from this war based on deception and the Vietnam War based on deception, their experiences and their insights virtually identical. In the War Made Easy book, I reprint the words of one song. It was a song written by Joe McDonald. In 1968 is when it first was released. And I'd like to share those words with you. Red and swollen tears tumble from her eyes, while cold silver birds who came to cruise the skies send death down to bend and twist her tiny hands, and then proceed to target B, in keeping with their plans. Cocky priests of Christendom, interpreters of love, ride a stone leviathan across a sea of blood and pound their feet into the sand of shores they've never seen. Delegates from the Western land to join the death machine, and we send cards and letters. The oxen lie beside the road, their bodies baked in mud, and fat flies chew out their eyes, then bathe themselves in blood, and superheroes fill the skies, tally sheets in hand. Yes, keeping score in times of war takes a superman. The junk crawls past hidden death, its cargo shakes inside, and soldier children hold their breath and kill them as they hide, and those who took so long to learn the subtle ways of death lie and bleed in paddy mud with questions on their breath, and we send prayers and praises. A lot of the speeches that have been given by the so-called Secretary of Defense in 2005 could have, with a few words changed, have been given in 1965 or 67 or 69 or 71. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara used to talk about how the U.S. role in Vietnam, the bombing campaigns that would drop huge quantities of warheads on North and South Vietnam, they were intended to send a message to the communist rulers in Hanoi. And if we're, I think, to understand what is wrong with U.S. foreign policy and the warfare state, if we're to understand what is wrong with the news media of this country that rather than serve as watchdogs for the war makers in Washington, serve so routinely, much more like lapdogs, then the capacity to see what is involved with sending those messages, I think, is crucial. And somebody who helped me understand that is named Chris Hedges. He wrote the book called Wars of Force That Gives Us Meaning. And he was a war correspondent in Central America. Later, he, for the New York Times, went to cover the Gulf War. And he was in El Salvador, and he recalled in his book the times that messages would be sent by the death squads, the paramilitaries in El Salvador. And they were messages sent by death squads that, as it happened, were aligned with the Salvadoran government, which, as it happened, was supported and funded by the U.S. government. And when it came to sending messages with dead bodies, Chris Hedges saw that up close. This is what he wrote. Corpses in wartime often deliver messages. The death squads in El Salvador dumped 3 bodies in the parking lot of the Camino Real Hotel in San Salvador, where the journalists were based, early one morning. Death threats against us were stuffed in the mouths of the bodies. And then Hedges added, and on a larger scale, Washington uses murder and corpses to transmit its wrath. We delivered such incendiary messages in Vietnam, Iraq, Serbia, and Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden has learned to speak the language of modern industrial warfare, unquote. Now, I should add that Chris Hedges didn't write that in the New York Times. He wrote that in his own book. Because as he points out in his book, when he covered the Gulf War for the New York Times, he wrote the same sort of stenography for the powerful and the easy throwaway descriptions of war that don't upset the home front too much. In short, he was a quote-unquote good mainstream journalist, unquote, and he was writing a first draft of history that left out of war its essence, which is fear and death. Hedges recalls, quoting here again, it was Robert McNamara, the American Secretary of Defense, in the summer of 1965, who defined the bombing raids that would eventually leave hundreds of thousands of civilians north of Saigon dead as a means of communication to the communist regime in Hanoi, unquote. Well, here we are 40 years later, and the so-called war on terrorism is also engaging in that sort of messaging, you might say. The war on terrorism, the central theme of current pro-war propaganda in the United States. And in pursuing that so-called war on terrorism, the United States and its military allies are routinely sending lethal messages. It should not surprise us when such messages are returned to sender. And that, I think, is a crucial point, because part of the notions of good old American exceptionalism involve the idea, that other people have these cycles of violence. You'll hear about it. Why can't they stop killing each other? Why can't they remember that we need a fresh page on history? We need to be able to move on. And yet, after 9/11, the message was clear. It came through the news media. It was transmitted from anybody who was considered to be anybody in Washington, that essentially 9/11 had written a blank check for U.S. militarism, and that it could be cashed with as much money and with as much blood as the smart people along Pennsylvania Avenue decided was good for the security of the country. And that, in fact, is what has been happening. If you look at what Secretary of Defense, and I keep having a problem with that word defense, because I wouldn't have a problem with a defense budget in this country, which is now routinely $500 billion a year, way, way, way over $1 billion a day spent on the military in this country. If we had a true defense budget, it would be way, 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 way smaller than that. Most of what is being spent is for military purposes, but not overlapping with anything that could be accurately described as defense. And if you look at this 9/11 license to kill, which was so defined by, not in so many words, the news media, and taken by the administration as such, you see that the response was, at its essence, and continues to be one of flagrant hypocrisy. Do as we say, not as we do. In 1968, I was fortunate enough to go to a hearing of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, chaired by J. William Fulbright. And one of the people on the committee at that point in history was Senator Wayne Morse, one of only 2 members of the U.S. Senate to vote against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution days after, with fraudulent media coverage, with absolute lies about the U.S. vessels being attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin in early August 1964. The Congress passed what was the closest to what ever became a declaration of war on Vietnam, another blank check. And in February 1968, I heard Wayne Morse say, and I went back and looked at the transcript decades later, "I do not intend to have the blood of this war on my hands." An extraordinary statement, unfortunately extraordinary, to come from a U.S. Senator, because here we are in really waning days already of 2005. And we can't hear U.S. Senators make such a statement because the blood is there, and for the usual rationalizations, they don't want to step too far out from what is considered mainstream thought, mainstream positions by mainstream media. And we know the history that George Bush lied and his administration lied, and the news media transmitted those lies as credible about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and all the rest of it. But we were told also as well that 9/11 changed the climate, made it possible politically in the United States to have this invasion of Iraq take place. And you go back to 9/11, and you see what was said from that day forward. I was starting to mention Donald Rumsfeld. 16 days after 9/11, the Secretary of Defense wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, and he said, "Get ready. This war will be like none other. There will be no exit strategies or timelines. There will be shifting alliances." He didn't use the word, as I recall, but he may as well have. This will be a perpetual war. It was not going to be a war to end all war. It was going to be a war to end peace. From the beginning of the responses, the flagrant hypocrisy, the do as we say, not as we do, was built into the U.S. government foreign policy post 9/11. When the Twin Towers fell during that crime against humanity on September 11, 2001, Colin Powell, the Secretary of State at that time, was in Latin America. And he issued a statement condemning, and quite correctly, condemning those who, as he put it, would destroy buildings and kill people for political purposes. This statement coming from someone who, more than anyone else in Washington during the administration of George H.W. Bush, led the way for the invasion of Panama, which resulted in, as people in Latin America found out through their news media rather quickly, but which we found out in the United States on 60 Minutes like a year later, dozens and dozens, evidently hundreds of people burned in their homes in Panama City and the vicinity through the U.S. attack. This is Colin Powell leading the way for that war, condemning those who would kill civilians for political purposes. And then the Gulf War. 6 weeks, according to Pentagon estimates that dribbled out, 100,000 Iraqi people killed in 6 weeks. Colin Powell, of course, under the first Bush administration, a hero of that war. And I quote in the book, he was giving an interview at the Pentagon shortly after that war ended. And he was asked, well, General Powell, what about the figures that might be gauged as to how many Iraqi people died during this war? And he said, and this is quoted in the book, it's on the record, he said, that's not a number that interests me very much. There's the infamous, because this is a bipartisan problem, there's the infamous quote from the Secretary of State during the Clinton administration, where Madeleine Albright was on 60 Minutes, and she was asked about the UN, the UNICEF estimate that 500,000 children had died because of US-led sanctions during the 1990s. And the Quote is there, it's in the transcript. Madeleine Albright was asked, do you think it's worth it? She said, well, it's difficult, but yes, we think it's worth it. So those are the kind of decisions that are made, and I would argue that the news media make those kind of decisions easier, because war makers thrive on abstraction. And that's why, over the summer, Cindy Sheehan had such a powerful effect, because she cut through the abstraction. She went to the gates of the president's ranch, as close as she could get, and she talked about how she had lost her son, who had been killed in Iraq under a commander-in-chief who sent soldiers there on the basis of lies. And she talked about loss. It's not only that she talked about loss that got her so much media coverage and got the anti-war movement so much coverage, because there have been people from the beginning talking about loss. I was just a few days ago in San Diego speaking alongside Fernando Suarez del Solar, whose son, Jesus, was one of the first U.S. soldiers to die in the invasion. It turned out, contrary to what the Pentagon first told Mr. Suarez, that his son, Jesus, was killed not by quote-unquote enemy fire, but by a U.S. cluster bomb, by friendly fire. And he had to find that out on his own. A war based on lies that Fernando Suarez del Solar and so many other loved ones of American soldiers have come to denounce. But when Cindy Sheehan went to Crawford, Texas, she stripped away the abstraction. The president now, as presidents during past wars, are able to use news media and utilize in the process those who come home, for instance, wounded. I think we could call it middle distance, that the president will do the photo ops with those who've been wounded in battle who come home. And they're close enough, they're kept close enough to be in the photo ops, but they are kept distant enough so that the realities, not the abstractions, but the human realities, are not brought into sharp focus. Well, I'm looking forward to your questions. I'd close by mentioning that in this book, War Made Easy, I found a few quotes that seemed especially apropos, and I'd to share a couple with you here. One is from King Lear. "'Tis the time's plague when madmen lead the blind." And I think that's a little bit unfair to apply to the current situation in the United States, in that, figuratively speaking, people in the United States are not blind. We're kept in the dark by news media that put out all kinds of information, misinformation, disinformation, what Paul Krasner calls disinfotainment, all kinds of different ways that we're kept disoriented from the political realities, from the true history unfolding in front of us, and the human consequences. And that, I think, is so key. We need, and we're going to be able to, I think, increasingly, as people in this country who are, to some significant extent, waking up about this war, to challenge the lies of mainstream media, to support independent media, such as KCSB here in Santa Barbara area, to see the vitality that independent, non-corporate, skeptical, journalistic-minded media can bring to the overall media terrain. And some of what we need is the information flow through the body politic, information in real time or soon that's accurate. And we also need analysis that is not the usual talking heads where we're encouraged to believe because they're shouting at each other on cable that decibels equals diversity. It doesn't necessarily. Nor should we believe that the long form means depth. You know, listen to All Things Considered, a morning edition, or Fresh Air on public radio. Watch the News Hour with Jim Lehrer. Maybe it's a long discussion. But if the sources are still limited, it doesn't matter how long they talk. The long form doesn't ensure any kind of depth to write home about. And then there's the other aspect of the human reality, and I think we need all three. The human consequences that are usually kept so abstracted by the war makers, by the aiders and abettors in Congress, by the news media. No, this is about real lives. This is about people dying. It's not some wave the flag, blow the trumpets, turn the page, time for a commercial. In 1946, at the time of the Nuremberg trials, Hermann Goering gave an interview. And I footnoted this as I footnote every quote in the book, but in this case with special appreciation that I could document it, because I'd seen this quote floating around on the internet, and I was glad to find that it actually is a real quote. It was in a book called Nuremberg Diary, written by G.M. Gilbert, who was an U.S. Army intelligence officer who interviewed Hermann Goering, the high-ranking Nazi official, during the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal. The interview was conducted on April 18th, 1946. This is what Hermann Goering said. "Why, of course the people don't want war." And then he went on, "But after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it is always a simple matter to drag the people along. Whether it is a democracy or a fascist dictatorship or a parliament or a communist dictatorship." And then Herr Goering said the following: "Voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to greater danger. It works the same in any country," unquote. Well, it works the same, more or less, but we have elements of democracy in our society. And as I quoted at the beginning, Eduardo Galeano, let's save pessimism for better times. As the great anti-fascist Antonio Gramsci wrote during the time of Mussolini, there's a need for pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. It's possible to stop wars. It's possible to prevent future wars. And part of that process is to challenge the news media, to create the kind of information and analysis flow that we need every day, 24/7, 365. As a journalist, the great independent journalist I.F. Stone said, "Every government is run by liars, and nothing they say should be believed." He wasn't conflating all governments. He wasn't saying that they're all the same or that governments lie all the time. He was saying that journalism is not real journalism and not to be trusted if the journalistic outlets and the analysts and the reporters trust and take on faith what a government says. And in many ways, in a real sense, the imperative for journalists is the same as the imperative for the rest of us. And that is to be skeptical, to participate in a democracy, not to consume history like it's Wonder Bread to take off the shelf, but to create history. I'd like to close with a brief few sentences, actually, from the book War Made Easy. The writer James Baldwin challenged our desire to deny responsibility, what he called the fraudulent and expedient nature of the American innocence, which has always been able to persuade itself that it does not know what it knows too well, unquote. Do we really not know that bombs financed by our tax dollars are turning life into death? Aren't we at least dimly aware that no matter how smooth and easy the news media and elected officials try to make it for us, in faraway places there are people not so different than us who are being destroyed by what journalists and politicians glibly depict as necessary war? Anyone who has the power to make you believe absurdities has the power to make you commit injustices, Voltaire wrote. The quotation is sometimes rendered with different wording. As long as people believe in absurdities, they will continue to commit atrocities. Either way, a quarter of a millennium later, Voltaire's statement is all too relevant to this moment. As an astute cliché says, truth is the first casualty of war. But another early casualty is conscience. When the huge news outlets swing behind warfare, the dissent propelled by conscience is not deemed to be very newsworthy. The mass media are filled with bright lights and sizzle, with high production values and lower human values, boosting the war effort. And for many Americans, the gap between what they believe and what's on their TV sets is the distance between their truer selves and their fearful passivity. Conscience is not on the military's radar screen, and it's not on our television screen. But government officials and media messages do not define the limits and possibilities of conscience. We do. Thank you very much.
In practical terms, how can I, as an ordinary person, challenge the media?
Well, I think it can involve challenging the mainstream media and building and sustaining alternatives. And on the latter note, I mentioned KCSB as an example of independent media outlets that are not so constrained as the mainstream media are. And I think often we're encouraged to believe, well, you build these independent outlets or you challenge the mainstream, and I'm in favor of doing both. If the daily paper in this city, if the TV, I can't imagine that there's not superb local TV news, right? But if local TV news, would happen to fall short of what's needed, they need to hear from us. We've been acculturated to believe that it's an abrogation of the First Amendment to picket a media outlet, which is, I think, the opposite of the case. It's an enlivening of the First Amendment, where if you feel that all else has failed, get out the leaflets and the picket signs, go down to the TV stations and the newspapers, and raise hell about it. And that involves, I think, a progress sequence that is part of organizing. Do the research, meet with the people at the media outlets, say, this is the problem. These voices are dominating on your outlets. These voices we're not hearing. We want better journalism, and we're not going away. And then if you don't get a satisfactory response, whether it's a print outlet, broadcast, or whatever, organize an organization, do that process of building community response. So in a nutshell, support the independents and challenge the mainstream. Let me say, too, that the Media Watch Group FAIR, where I've been an associate since it started in the mid-1980s, has a superb website, www.fair.org. And on the site, you can sign up for a media activist list. There's about 80,000 people on there who will get messages maybe a couple times a week. It will supplement your local organizing with ways you can send emails and make phone calls and letters. One other thing, I'm with the Institute for Public Accuracy, we put out close to 200 news releases a year offering to mainstream media the voices that are not corporate-backed, that widen the range of discussion. And you can go to our website. We're at www.accuracy.org. You can also sign up there. And then you can utilize these news releases and go to those media outlets locally and nationally and say, hey, these folks are available. Do we only have to hear the range of opinion from A to C, or can we have a wider part of the alphabet in terms of perspectives?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming this afternoon. I have several questions, but so I'll give those to you, and then you can respond to all of them, or the one that is most interest to you. The first one is dealing with my observation that the media in this country were really marshaled into getting ready to cover the war in Iraq months ahead of time. It was sort of a initiation process, and we know then the use of this strategy of embedding journalists with American units abroad. And so I'd like you to comment on that development, the embedment of journalists in fostering the rationale for war and just gaining support of the public for war. And also in light of what's happened with Hurricane Katrina, because it seems like that is an event that could not be marshaled by the government or by the military, and you actually had journalists on the ground sort of giving you their raw emotions in terms of what was happening to the people on the street, at least for a time. And it seems like in the follow-up they're trying to repackage it again, but nonetheless there was a kind of a moment when the mask was removed and the embedded journalism failed. The second question is basically Judith Miller. one of these people that I guess was in bed before the embedded folks were in bed and transmitting the reports of weapons of mass destruction being present in Iraq, and that being covered by the New York Times for how many months? I heard it like a year and a half or so, if not more. And then she was unmasked in the aftermath when the investigation said there were no weapons of mass destruction there, and found out that one of her sources was Chalabi, etc. But now there seems to be an effort to resuscitate her at the New York Times, even on the LA Times today, to talk about her as a symbol of the freedom of the press in our country, going to jail for principles. So if you could comment on that issue too. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, taking the second point first, I think what has happened with Judith Miller in terms of her going to jail for, what was it, more than 2 months and so forth, it really does provide an instance of proof where the problems of the U.S. news media are institutional, not individual. Because she was in jail during that time, and there was still crappy coverage in the New York Times on her beat, And I'm actually quite serious about that sometimes we think, well, this individual is the problem, or 2 or 3 individuals, when actually the problem is much deeper than that. And in the case of Judith Miller, yes, she was very questionable, very dubious in terms of how she behaved in covering the supposed weapons of mass destruction. But it was the New York Times management that put her stories on the front page. That really didn't probe this question of what is the sources, what are the sources that she is using. And my reference to the coverage of the times when she was in jail, she didn't have a laptop computer, she didn't have a terminal, she wasn't involved in coverage, and you could see the agenda building for the war in Iran over the summer while she was in jail. And this is something that, again, it's like, and the United States is the United States. There are dynamics in the U.S. mass media that are taking their nod from the sources in the executive branch that are laying out the groundwork for war, what I call laying the flagstones to war. And that path is something made possible by the news media, and it's an institutional problem. So yes, Judith Miller's reporting was horrendous about Iraq leading up to the war, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, she's always been a government collaborator in that sense. This is going back many years. She put forward the messages that were the most in sync with the agenda building for U.S. military intervention in the Middle East, which happens to be her specialty in terrorism and so forth. On the question of embedding, which is actually quite related and also, I think, an important question, I quote in the book a military official who spoke at the University of California, Berkeley, some time after the invasion, and he was in a kind of a gloating mood. And he said, and you can find the exact quote in the book, but he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, the embedding innovation was a really smart way to get the initiative for us for propaganda. And I think that that's a fair statement. The embedding of, I think it was 700 journalists that the Pentagon made possible, put them in with the U.S. military units. And you had, even more than usual, the reporters from the front saying, we're about to advance. We are doing this. We're on patrol. We're doing this kind of thing. They did almost everything but wave a rifle. And I would not really, and this was absolutely premeditated and calculated. There was an accurate calculation that the embedding process would change the dynamic from the Gulf War, when it was all very far removed, and journalists, it was also an effective way to have war propaganda, but journalists complained, gee, we can't get near the front, you're just showing us videos, why are you restricting access? And the Pentagon response this time was, you want access, you'll get access. And the calculation that was borne out was that the war would be seen through the eyes of the invaders, which is really what happened. With some exceptions, there was some good reporting, embedded and unembedded, but on the whole, you look at the balance of coverage, that was the case. They moved on with the troops. A reporter named John Donovan with Nightline did a piece pointing out he was not embedded. He stayed in the town after the embeds moved on with the troops. And with a lot of poignancy, he talked about the term collateral damage, and he said, here's the man, his wife is collateral damage. The embeds have moved on with the troops that killed his wife. And so the embedding process, I think, would have at least had some balance if you had a roughly equal number of U.S. journalists embedded with people at the other end of the missiles. Not just those who were invading, but those who were being invaded. Not just those who were firing the missiles, but those who were in their homes being slaughtered courtesy of the U.S. taxpayers. And this kind of goes into the last part of that question, emotions. There was big controversy after the Katrina hurricane, and Anderson Cooper and others from the major cable networks moved in, and they could be seen tearing up or weeping, choking up alongside the enormous suffering. I personally think that's just fine. That's a human reaction. Well, let's imagine that Anderson Cooper or some of his colleagues were in Iraq, the invasion has taken place, and the correspondent weeps next to the lifeless body of an Iraqi child who's been killed by Pentagon firepower. How long do you think it would take before an uproar forced the recall of that correspondent who, we would be told, had lost his or her objectivity, could no longer cover the story with balance? And I think that really is just one little window in to how the ethic of what's been called worthy and unworthy victims plays out so viciously in U.S. news media. We're essentially given messages, often just implicit. You should ask for whom the bell tolls. You know, if they're Kurds in Iraq, Saddam Hussein killed them, it's terrible, which it was. If the Kurds are in Turkey and they're slaughtered by the member NATO government of Turkey, U.S. ally, scarcely makes the news not judged to be important. That tells us a lot about the double standards of U.S. news media.
You spoke a bit about how there are a lot of major news organizations getting their information from people high up in the government with perhaps interests in seeing, with certain agendas. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on how to diversify the range of sources that, how to combat that problem, diversify the range of sources that journalists are able to utilize, because it seems like one of the major kind of institutional problems that you've mentioned with respect to American journalism.
Yes, I think it is a major institutional problem. The reliance on official sources and the slowness and often the absolute failure to have sources gain much prominence in the reporting or in the public broadcasts and so forth, that would run counter to the official sources. And so there's this lag time, as I said, the cliche that journalism is the first draft of history, and it's such bad history precisely because the sourcing is so limited. Journalists can do it if they want to. Sometimes it's more difficult. I mean, to take a domestic example, we have, 10, 11, 12% of the workforce unionized in this country? Well, anytime there's a workplace issue, it's easy to find the company. But maybe the workforce at that employer's location is unionized, maybe isn't, in most cases not. So it takes more legwork to go out and find those sources. In general, poor people don't have PR firms working for them. You can always call the corporation that's building a new plant or polluting or whatever, doesn't want to pay a living wage, but you might actually have to go out and find people who are affected. What do we get in the media every day? We get reports, among other things, on how the stock market is doing. We get every uptick and downturn of the Dow and NASDAQ is reported scrupulously on the hour. NPR has it on the hour. Lets us know. They have business report. I can't find that public radio nationally does not have one labor program. They have programs devoted to investing and the market and so forth. They don't have a single labor program. And it goes to that question of what indices even matter. There are records kept somewhere about how many people died on the job last week. What is the wait time at the county emergency room? That could be reported. Might take a little bit more work than the Dow Jones Industrial Average, but still, it could be done. It could be reported. It isn't reported. The daily newspapers have a business section every day. They don't have a labor section. We take that for granted. We think it has, or we're encouraged to believe it has something to do with journalistic judgment. Yeah, it has to do with journalistic judgment that has its feet in the cement of power and precedent and privilege, and that's what it's about. And the same goes in terms of foreign policy. The people who are suffering from U.S. foreign policy, they generally don't have K Street law firms and lobbyists, and they don't have people who do their PR for them in Washington or anywhere else.
Hi. I thought it was interesting and important how you mentioned that this administration, this war is very similar to wars in the past, and that the priorities and the policies of the U.S. now are not very different from how they were. And at the same time, a lot of people feel that the Bush administration is unique in its, like, not only the magnitude of the war, but also kind of its policies in general. What do you think is do you think there's anything unique about the Bush administration and just about the media in our situation right now versus the past?
Well, I think the Bush administration is more extreme in its militarism. And I think we're living in an instance, in a time where quantity becomes a qualitative shift because the massive amount of military spending. And let me go back to King Lear. When madmen have so much power over policy, in terms of just regard for human life, in regard to logic, then you have massive spending that is going on that cranks up the militarism that's always been there. This is a bipartisan problem. And sometimes when we say, yes, this is a bipartisan problem, the response to the media is tacitly, oh, well, then there's no issue here. You know, it's the wallpaper. What are you complaining about? You know, it's a problem. It's a problem no matter who's president. We're now in I think, the most dire straits we've ever been. What's unique about this administration? Well, I mean, I think every period is different. I think that 9/11 gave them more of a blank check than we've had in the past. They have a terrorism card to play that they've played to great effect and manipulation. Lyndon Johnson, as I quote in the book, called the National Liberation Front terrorists in Vietnam. But it was just one theme out of many, many, whereas now obviously terrorism is a huge part of the propaganda pack that's drawn from. So overall, I mean, I would just say that the problems are historic. They've continued. Militarism has been part of U.S. foreign policy for many, many decades. So has the deception. And at the same time, this administration is extraordinarily dangerous, even by the baseline of the recent decades.
My question tails into that answer exactly. I had an opportunity to be at the 9/11 Commission hearings, particularly the one with Rumsfeld and Condoleezza Rice. And I was there as a member of the press, and what was very frustrating was that information was not being disseminated at all, really. And I consider the administration to be a black hole of information. What was really frightening, however, was not that I wasn't getting information, was that the other branch of governments were not getting information. Do you deal with this in your book, or do you see connections from the Vietnam era?
Well, the lack of information flow, I mean, I.F. Stone did a lot of his reporting by going through transcripts. And I don't know if that speaks to your question, but even in the official record, there's so much of value that simply doesn't make the cut in the mass media, or it's put in a way that doesn't make much sense. You know, it doesn't, to use the cliche, connect dots. It's just kind of out there because of the trust level, among other things. Journalists pretty much imitate other journalists. They don't make a lot of connections. They are discouraged from drawing out contradictions. You know, you sit at a hearing And you can see, or you read the transcripts, the contradictions are often extreme. You know, what is being said by one official, or even the same official, an hour apart, you're right?
Yeah.
And part of the job of journalism should be to highlight those, because nobody can read 80,000 words of transcript, or very few people, certainly the public isn't going to. And yes, I think it's very true during the Vietnam War. There was all kinds of information that was very significant, that was coming through the congressional process. Not that it was a great process, but it did illuminate some information, and very little of it getting in the mass media.